We welcome today former Secret Service agent and current author Mr. Clint Hill. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Hill has written several books about his time in the Secret Service, from the Eisenhower presidency through the Ford administration. He has been involved in the protection detail of 5 U.S. presidents, and his latest book is called 5 Presidents. We will talk specifically about that book in just a moment, of course, but as many know, Mr. Hill is also known for his actions on the day President Kennedy was assassinated on the streets of Dallas in 1963. Mr. Hill, you're one of the iconic images in American history, not unlike the images of smoke billowing out of the World Trade Center on 9/11, the young female college student leaning over the victim at Kent State, perhaps Neil Armstrong stepping onto the moon. But the image of you on the back of the presidential limousine when JFK was shot is one of the most indelible in the minds of not only Americans of that generation, but indeed people all over the world. How does it feel to be among such a group of iconic images in American history?
Well, I was thrust onto the pages of history. I didn't seek it. And so it's an experience you don't wish on anybody. But I'm just hopeful that my going around and talking about what actually happened there in Dealey Plaza will help some people better understand what did go on.
When was the first time you returned to Dallas after 1963?
Came back to Dallas in 1990. I wanted to walk that area, and I did. I walked Dealey Plaza, went up in the Texas School Book Depository to the 6th floor, sat in that window, looked out of it, where the lone shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, had been. And it was a very emotional experience, but I had to do that for my own sanity. And I came away with the conclusion that based on all the facts that day, the angle, the weather, the motorcade type, where everybody was positioned, Lee Harvey Oswald had all the advantages. We did not have any. And I came away knowing that I'd done everything I could that day. There was not anything more I could have done.
One of the things I've often told people is to go to that museum and look out that window. It's very obvious that it was actually an easy shot, right?
Very much so. It's a lot smaller area than most people think. The distance from the window to the impact area, the first shot, is very, very close. So was not a difficult shot at all.
And with the scope almost a certainty.
Oh, yes, absolute certainty.
As difficult it is, I'm sure, probably every interview you ever do is eventually come back to the subject of what happened in Dallas. Tell us your firsthand account of what happened when the motorcade turned down Elm Street.
Well, we'd come through the streets of Dallas, and the crowds had been very large, and they were extremely enthusiastic and friendly. And then we came down Houston from the main street, and then we turned left onto Elm. And there weren't many people in that general area, not considering the numbers of people that we had seen before. But we got down Elm Street about 150 feet, and I was standing on the car immediately behind the presidential car. I was on the left-hand side. I was scanning to my left and straight ahead, and all of a sudden, I hear this explosive noise over my right shoulder. I wasn't sure exactly what it was. At first, I thought it was a firecracker or something of that type. But I turned toward that noise, but I didn't get all the way there. My eyes only got as far as the back of the presidential car. I saw President Kennedy's reaction to the first shot, which was to grab at his throat and fall to his left. I knew then that it was a gunshot, and I jumped and I ran. My intent was to get up on the top of the back of the car to form a shield there to protect all the occupants of the vehicle. But just before I got there, a third shot rang out and hit the president in the head. The second shot I didn't even hear because I was running and I was moving between the follow-up car that I'd been on and a motorcycle officer and his motorcycle unit were right next to me. And so that noise from those two engines precluded my hearing that second shot. But the third shot I heard and I felt because when it penetrated the president's skull, there was such an eruption of material that there was blood and brain matter and bone fragments all over me, all over Mrs. Kennedy, and all over the car.
How close were you actually to him when that happened?
I had not reached the car quite yet. I was maybe 2 steps back of the rear of his car, and then the shot hit him, and it just caused a massive eruption of its head.
Now, when you look at the Zapruder film, you see your image running towards the car, grabbing towards the handle on the back of the car and trying to get your foot on that little ledge that's on the back bumper and slipping for a second. And that was because they had just sped up, realizing what had happened. Is that right?
That's correct. The driver had accelerated, and when he did that, I slipped off the position I had tried to achieve, and I had to run a couple extra strips in order to get up on the car.
A lot of people agree that your actions that day were heroic, and certainly they were. You saved Mrs. Kennedy's life, not from fear of perhaps additional shots, because we know from witnesses that Oswald pulled the rifle back in the window after the third shot that struck the president's head. But almost immediately, as you were running toward the car and getting very, very close, she began to climb out on the back trunk of the car, right?
That's correct. She came up on the trunk just as I was trying to get up on the back. She came up on the trunk to try and retrieve some of that material that came out of the president's head, and she did. She didn't know I was there at the time. I grabbed her and helped her into the back seat, and when I did that, the president's body fell to its left with his head in her lap, and the right side of his face was up. And when I looked down from my position on top of the car, I could see that his eyes were fixed, that the hole in the skull was vacant of any brain material, and so I knew that in all likelihood it was a fatal shot.
One of the aspects of this that a lot of people may not realize is with the close proximity of the follow-up Secret Service car and the understanding that the president's car sped up the moment that it did, and she was just getting on the back of the car, there was actually a serious danger that she might fall off the back of the car had you not been there to get her back into the seat. And by doing that, you probably did save her life that day.
Well, if she had fallen off the back of the follow-up car would never have been able to stop.
Right.
They would have driven right over her.
Describe the scene on their way to the hospital.
Well, I was wedged in on top of the back seat, my arm on the left-hand side, my legs on the right, and we were running pretty fast. I don't know exactly how fast, but upwards over 60, maybe as high as 80. And nothing was said. It was very calm and quiet in the car, but nobody was saying anything.
Wasn't any screaming or anything like that?
Nothing like that at all. At one point, Mrs. Connolly, who was seated immediately in front of Mrs. Kennedy and had pulled the governor down after he was hit into her lap, she lifted up, and I could see that the governor's front of his shirt was bloody. So that's the first I realized that he had also been hit.
Do you think that the agents in the years after, by not giving any public statements about what happened, contributed in any way to the crazy and insane conspiracy theories that have come up in the ensuing years?
Perhaps. It's hard to say. We did not talk about it. I did testify to the Warren Commission, gave them a statement, and then I did do a 60 Minutes interview in 1975. But other than that, we never talked about it amongst ourselves as agents. We never talked about it with our families. The first time we really talked about it among ourselves or as a group was in 2010, as we had a small reunion of a small group of people here in Dallas.
And why, in the length of time between that and when the event occurred, was there no talk about it? Did you just try to forget about it or put it out of your mind, or were you sworn to secrecy or any of that thing?
No, we weren't sworn to secrecy. Nobody told us we could not talk about it. It was too painful to talk about. That was the real problem. In fact, it was so painful that when I wrote a book called 5 Days in November about the assassination, I tried to get an fellow agent of mine who was on the Kennedy detail to talk about it with me, and he would not because it hurt too much. He said it was too painful. He just couldn't do it.
Even after all these years?
Even after all these years.
What made you come forward with starting to talk about it and share your stories?
Well, I was asked to assist a young lady in the writing of a book. It was being written by a former agent and a friend of mine. And in so doing, I began to release some information. After I learned that how trustworthy she was, then I told her more and more information about what happened that day. And that, in the end, really was cathartic for me. And so the more I talked about it, the more I wrote about it and the more I appeared in public talking about it, the better I felt.
An area of discussion in recent years from Mr. Blaine's book that you just referred to centered around President Kennedy not wanting agents on the back of the car during parades. Tell us about that and why, for the most part, agents were not on the back of the car in Dallas for most of the parade.
Most of the time when we're in that kind of a situation, we will have agents up on the back of that car. This goes back into the 1962-63 period. But on November 18th, 1963, the president was in Tampa, Florida, and they had a 26-mile motorcade. And the advance agent, realizing that the agents weren't be able to run on the street for 26 miles because it was hot and humid, he decided to take two of them and put them up on the back of the car. There are two places where you can stand on the rear bumper, specially prepared, and then there are handholds also. And so that's where they would be. Well, midway through this 26-mile motorcade, the crowd dissipated. The president was looking around. He noticed the agents were there. He tapped the agent in the right front seat, who was a supervisor, on the shoulder, and he said, "Floyd, will you please get those Ivy League charlatans off the back of my car, please?" And so eventually they got off. They couldn't get off immediately because of the speed. But then at the end of the motorcade, the president came to the senior supervisor and the advance agent. And he said, "Look, fellas, when we're in a situation like this where I'm campaigning, I can't afford to have it appear that there's anything between the people and myself. And when the agents are up there hovering like that, people get the wrong idea that I'm not just like they are. And I want them to have that feeling. So from now on, please, whenever possible, unless it's an absolute emergency, don't have anybody up in the back of the car."
Do you think it would have made any difference if somebody was on the back of the car when this happened?
Perhaps it would have. It may have made Oswald to change his mind. He may have tried to fire as we approached the Texas School Book Depository. It's hard to say, but at least we would have had a better chance.
In the event agents would have been on the back of the car after the first shot, clearly you would have leapt toward the president over the back of the car, right? Wouldn't that have been what would have happened?
We would have covered everybody up with our bodies, and the driver would have accelerated immediately.
One of the things that in one of your books you talked about was there was a desire from the top of the Secret Service to not necessarily talk about this too much because they didn't want the public thinking that the Secret Service was blaming Kennedy for what happened. Is that correct?
That is correct. That was our director, James Rowley, he was called the chief at that time, advised us that we did not want in any way to have this appear that President Kennedy had brought this on himself.
Did any of the agents actually feel that way?
Not that I'm aware of. All of us felt guilt for what happened, failure for not being able to fulfill our responsibility, and I think most of us still feel that way today somewhat.
Many might be surprised to know that car, SS100X, isn't that the designation?
That's correct.
Was actually put back into the service after the assassination. Painted, the front grille changed out, a hardtop put on it, some protection added to it. How odd was it to still work with that car knowing what had happened in it?
Well, I worked with it in the inaugural parade in 1965 when President Johnson was inaugurated and sworn in. And I was in the same position on the car that day, left rear. It was a little bit weird, but...
that had to be surreal.
Yeah, it was somewhat. But it was just it's a job, it's something you had to do. It turned out that in 1969, during the Nixon-Agnew inaugural parade, that same car was used for Vice President Agnew in the inaugural parade. And I was in the front seat of that car on that parade.
Wow. Did any presidents ever have a problem or refuse to ride in that vehicle?
Not that I'm aware of. The only request made by a president was President Johnson requested that it be painted black rather than the midnight blue it had been.
He wanted people to think that it wasn't the same car?
Presumably. I'm not sure exactly what his reasoning was.
Now, you remained as an agent assigned to Mrs. Kennedy for another year after the assassination, which you describe in your book, Mrs. Kennedy and Me. Describe what that was like in the year after the assassination.
That was a very difficult year. Every day I had to look in the eyes of Caroline and John, the president's two children, realizing that they no longer had a father, and that I was part of the group that was responsible for keeping him alive, and we failed to fulfill that responsibility. I also dealt every day with his widow, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, and that was difficult as well from an emotional point of view.
Did you and Mrs. Kennedy ever speak of the assassination?
We never discussed it. It never was a subject that we talked about.
Did you ever hear her speak of it with others?
I heard her speak briefly in a recording, but she didn't say much about that that she did for Arthur Schlesinger, which has been released. And occasionally she would mention it, I guess, to her brother-in-law, Robert Kennedy.
How fearful of her for herself and her children was she after the JFK assassination and then the RFK assassination?
Well, prior to the RFK assassination, somewhat concerned about mostly the children more than anything else. She was afraid that they would be inundated with photographers and people wanting to see them, and she didn't want them to grow up spoiled. She wanted them to be as normal as possible. She knew that was going to be very difficult. As for herself, she was concerned, but not as concerned as she was for the children.
Did you stay in touch with Mrs. Kennedy in the years after your detail with her ended?
After I left and went back to the White House after the presidential election in November 1964, occasionally she would call and we would discuss the protective activity that was going on in New York where she had moved, for the children principally. Sometimes she had some recommendations as to corrections and things. So it was a very friendly conversation. And then the last time I did see or talk to her personally was when Robert Kennedy had been killed and the body was brought from New York to Washington, D.C. by train. I was with President Johnson as we met that train, and I did go up to her, express my condolences, and wish her well. That's the last time I saw or talked to her.
You went on to be in LBJ's protection detail. How different was it covering him than Eisenhower or JFK?
Well, it was quite different in that we no longer would go to a place like Hyannisport or Palm Beach. We would come down to the ranch here in Texas because President Johnson loved his ranch. He was born and raised out there, and he knew every foot of ground, and he knew everything, all the local ranchers, and so it was home, and he loved to come home and spend as much time as he could there. He was very unpredictable. He thought that surprise was his best element of defense, and so he wanted as few people to know what he was planning to do as possible. Oftentimes that included us, the Secret Service. Sometimes it also included the members of the helicopter crews and the Jetstar crews, and so it got to be a little bit difficult sometimes.
The online website YouTube has recordings of phone calls of the various presidents, many of which you covered, obviously, and worked on their detail of. And the candor, language, and methods of dealing with people and problems are pretty obvious in those recordings. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to listen to any of them, but you were likely there for moments just like those. Have you had the opportunity to listen to any of them?
I don't recall listening to. I think I've heard one or two, but not many.
They're fascinating behind-the-scenes looks at what goes on and some of the very private conversations at the time, but the public president versus the private president, it's a good message of that. Often two different things. How would you describe your observation of that?
Well, he used to give me anyway, what was called the Johnson treatment, which was get right up in my face and poke me in the chest when he was trying to vent. It may not have anything to do with anything I had done, anything the Secret Service had done, or anything we even knew about. But he had to vent somewhere. And I always thought, well, better me than somebody else, so you just stand there and take it. And he could chew you out pretty good. But he was a very serious man when it came to doing the government's business. very involved in everyday activity. He loved his ranch so much that he would have members of the cabinet down there. He would bring down the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They would have all kinds of meetings right there on the front lawn of the LBJ Ranch.
He's probably one of the more bipartisan presidents we've ever had. Wouldn't you agree?
Somewhat, yes. He worked both sides of the aisle.
In your new book, Five Presidents, you talk of not only JFK, LBJ, but of course you began with Eisenhower back in the 50s and through JFK, LBJ, Nixon, and all the way up to Ford. You covered them all. Describe each one as best you can in your personal observation of them.
Well, starting with Eisenhower, of course, he was a general, and he was a military man at heart because that had been his life. And he treated the troops, or the agents like myself, as just like his troops. He called us when we needed us. He would say, "Hey, agent." He didn't call us by name. But he was a very congenial man, very even-tempered. He was very schedule conscious. If we told him to get in the car or that we needed to leave at, let's say, 9:30, he would be in the car at 9:29.30. And we knew that. He was just so regularly and scheduled that he was never a problem from that point of view. And he wasn't really a politician. He didn't wade into crowds and shake hands, that type of thing. Loved to play golf, as everybody knows. Loved to also fish for trout and hunt grouse. So he was an all-around busy, active man. He was 70 years old when he left office, and we went from that to a 43-year-old new father and who had a 3-year-old daughter and a 31-year-old wife. And so that was a big difference in and of itself. We had to make many, many adjustments because of that. President Kennedy was very congenial, very charismatic. He knew each and every one of the agents by name, called them by their first names, was very concerned about our welfare. For example, in Palm Beach, when the agents first got there, some of them were still in their winter suits because it was in December of 1960. And he noticed that, and he went and he got a whole group of his own personal polo shirts, came out, gave them to one of the agents and told him to distribute this among the agents. I want them all to feel comfortable, and they'll be able to do a better job if they are comfortable. So he was just a very nice guy to work with and for. And then we went from him to President Johnson, who was quite different. He had been the political leader in the Senate. And now he had been vice president and now thrust into the presidency. And he was a bigger-than-life politician. He knew how to get things done, and he worked both sides of the aisle, like you've indicated. But his one thing he really loved was his ranch here in Texas. He wanted to spend as much time as he could on that ranch, and we did. We spent a considerable time here. We did travel a lot. Some of it was very unprepared, unpredictable, and it was a spur-of-the-moment type things, but we managed to make it work. Before he left office, he had a meeting of all the agents that had worked on his detail on the south lawn of the White House. He thanked us, and he apologized to all of us for some of the things that he had said or some of the actions he had taken, because he knew that we were all there on his behalf, not on our own. President Nixon had a personality that was rather unique. It was more than two personalities, kind of a split one public and one personal. He was somewhat of an introvert, so much so that he established a separate office in the executive office building across the street from the White House, where he would go and be alone in that office. I guess where he would think and make notes and write. He was another individual who didn't trust a lot of people. He was a man that wanted to reduce the number of troops in Vietnam, and he did so. But when he did that, he increased the bombing, which caused a problem among the student population in the United States, and the anti-war demonstrators came out, and that increased problem led for more and more demonstrations. And a result was Kent State, where 3 of 4 of the students were shot, which was extremely terrible. But Vietnam was his nemesis, and he never really recovered from the emotional strife that took, or that emotional baggage he had with that. He never got over that, and that's really the reason that he left the office in 1960. I'm talking about
1974.
Yeah, he left that in 74, but he left the office under a cloud because of what had happened at Watergate.
How did you notice a change? What change did you notice when he was vice president? Because you were there when he was vice president, and then later when he became president.
Well, one thing about when he was vice president, he and President Eisenhower did not have a close relationship. He wasn't included in many of the meetings that were held. And at one point, somebody asked Eisenhower to tell him something that Nixon had done, and he said, well, if you give me about a week, I'll think about it. And that was an indication of the relationship. And toward the end of, in 1960, when he was running as vice president against John Kennedy, the really only campaigning that President Eisenhower did for Vice President Nixon was about the last 6 days of the campaign. He hadn't done anything up until that point. And then the day after the election, we went to Augusta, Georgia to play golf. So the relationship wasn't very warm. But Nixon, I always said that one of the biggest mistakes he made, he had what they called an enemies list. And if he would have put his name at the top, because he was his own worst enemy, and if he'd have recognized that, he probably wouldn't have been in all the trouble that he was in.
You think he was paranoid?
I don't know if that's the right word. There were, toward the end, and after the Watergate thing broke in 72, it just seemed like he was more withdrawn than ever, and it just seemed to be more problems. I couldn't say he was paranoid, but perhaps.
And what about President Ford?
President Ford came into office not being elected to the office, not even being elected to the vice presidency. He was appointed and then thrust into the office. He was a very nice man. He actually lived not too far from me in Alexandria, Virginia. His youngest son and my oldest son were high school classmates in Alexandria. And he gave the commencement address as vice president at their high school, T.C. Williams High School. And but he was liked by most people. And then he pardoned Richard Nixon. After that pardon of Richard Nixon, a great percentage of those people who had been supporting him withdrew their support. And it was a complete change of heart for many people, and things became more difficult for him.
You mentioned in the book, I think it was the quote, something to the effect of in the media, comedians and Saturday Night Live shows and things like this made him a bumbling idiot almost, but you had a different perception of that.
He was a very well-coordinated athlete. He was a football star at Michigan. He was a lineman. He loved to swim and was a good swimmer. He loved to snow ski. Was very efficient at it. He also liked to play tennis and golf. So he was very active and very well coordinated. So I don't know where Chevy Chase and some of those other people got the idea that he was a bumbling idiot. I think it was from one time in walking down the front ramp of Air Force One, he stumbled. And from that point on, that was the image that was portrayed.
Which of the presidents would you say handled the presidency the best that you covered?
Well, it's difficult to say because each one faced different challenges. So I don't know that you could say that any one of those 5 men handled it any better than the others. I suppose you'd have to say that Nixon probably handled it the worst. But Kennedy, for example, in the Bay of Pigs, that was a very big blunder. And then in his initial meeting with Khrushchev, in Vienna in June of 1961 was not a very successful meeting, which gave Khrushchev the opinion that he was dealing with a weak president. And wasn't too long after that the Berlin Wall was built. But then he recovered by the way he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, you know, each one of those presidents had ups and downs depending upon the situation.
On a personal level, what did you like or dislike about each?
I liked them all. I thought they were all very dedicated to the people of the United States, and were all trying to do their best for the country itself. I didn't ever have the feeling that they were in it for themselves. I always had the feeling they were in it to do whatever they could to help generally the people of the United States.
You talked in your book about Nixon asking the Secret Service to spy on Ted Kennedy. I believe it was in the 1972 election. Are you aware that there's now a YouTube video that has that conversation that actually coincides with the comments you made about that?
I don't know that I've ever heard that.
Here is the recording of that.
He gave it's my understanding that he directed one of his assistants, because I got the telephone call from Alex Butterfield, the presidential assistant, requesting that be done. And I told Mr. Butterfield that we had all the people that we needed, and we had selected them, and they were the right people for the right job. So he didn't convince me to do it. And a few minutes later, I received another telephone call, this time from an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. We were part of the Treasury Department at that time. And he told me more or less that I didn't get the picture. That's what the White House wanted. That's what the White House was going to get. And if I wasn't willing to do that, they'd find someone who was.
Did it happen?
We did put the man on there. What I did was he was a field agent who was under the jurisdiction of this assistant director for criminal investigations. I was the assistant director for protective forces. I went to the office of criminal investigations, talked to the deputy assistant director, Jim Burke, explained the situation to him. He called the agent involved, advised him that we were aware that the Nixon administration wanted him on that detail, and we were quite sure we knew why. We knew that he had a close personal relationship with some of the Nixon staff, as well as President Nixon himself, and he was advised that if any information was revealed to the Nixon administration, he would pay the consequences.
Were you ever in a situation that you were afraid that the assassination might happen again? Were you ever in a situation where you just really tensed up and thought, boy, we're about to get it again?
Well, not so much that way, but I was concerned every time we went out of the secure confines of the White House, or if we were traveling, whenever we left the secure confines of Air Force One. Then I was concerned because it could happen at any time. We never knew exactly what was going on around that next corner.
You said years ago that if a person is intent on killing the president, in the end, there's really no protection that'll stop it. Do you still believe that?
Yes, pretty much so. If an individual is willing to sacrifice their life by killing the president, there's not much someone can do, provided you do not know that this person has that intent.
I'm acquainted with an agent on President Bush's detail here in Dallas. She's the mother of one of the scouts in my son's scout troop. And I've noticed when I'm around her, even in a social setting, she's an active agent now. Even in a social setting, I notice that her eyes are always darting around the room, scoping things out. And it's probably just by nature, her doing that. Is that something that you still find yourself doing, or did it take you a while to get over that?
Well, I don't know if it's unfortunate or what it is, but no, I'm still doing it, and it's often pointed out to me by my co-author Lisa McCubbin or someone in whose presence I am that my habits haven't changed. I'm always looking around the entire room. I'm always trying to keep my back to the wall. Those habits just don't die hard.
Lastly, let me ask you this. Much of what we talked about is pretty heavy stuff and very serious and in many ways untoward. What would you say is the funniest thing that's ever happened to you while covering a president of the United States?
Well, I suppose it had to be with Lyndon Baines Johnson. We were finishing an around-the-world trip, and as we were flying from Rome back to the United States, we had to refuel in the Azores. And when we landed, just before we landed, the pilot had arranged with the post exchange on the Azores, it was an Air Force base, to remain open so that the people on the aircraft could do their Christmas shopping because it was Christmas Eve. Mm-hmm. And we'd been gone now for some time, and nobody had a chance to do any Christmas shopping. And we were going to arrive in Washington completely empty-handed. And so everybody decided to go shopping. The president had put on his pajamas on the plane, and he had gone to bed, and he was sound asleep. So I told everybody to go ahead, and so I waited down at the foot of the ramp. I said, I'll take care of things here. You just go on and go shopping. And everybody had been gone maybe 5 minutes. And I hear this voice. It says, "Hey, Clint, where's everybody?" It was Lyndon Johnson. He was standing at the top of the ramp in the doorway of Air Force One in his pajamas. So I said, "Mr. President, it's Christmas Eve, and they've all gone to the post exchange to buy some Christmas gifts." He said, "Well, hell, I haven't done any Christmas shopping either. Let's go." So he reached in a coat closet behind him, put on a trench coat, came down the stairs of the Air Force One in his pajamas. I gathered up a Air Force car and driver, put him in the back seat, and we drove off to the post exchange where the employees witnessed their commander-in-chief do his Christmas shopping in his pajamas. They were shocked.
Mr. Hill, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. I do count you as an absolute American hero, and I wish you nothing but the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.